So today, as the slide says, we're going to be talking about design systems and sort of the idea of what it takes to actually take this from conceptualization all the way to an end product, both in the context of legacy and new. For most of us, we're probably used to having legacy products floating around, being in healthcare, and there's sort of different challenges around that and brand new stuff, which is also sort of exciting in its own way. So before we jump in, a little about myself. I'm Rehan. I'm a designer, as I like to say, a combination hybrid of design and technologist. And my background's in a sort of a combination of things, both architecture, as in building architecture, design more traditionally, and then also computer science. So that's sort of the lens in which I'll come to share this talk. So here's some of the folks that I've worked with in the past. Lots of variety of places, so sort of in educational technologies, looking at consumer advocacy, and how do we help make informed buying decisions or other decisions for folks. And obviously most currently within the healthcare space, looking at radiology, pharmacy-related things, and of course most recently, COVID-specific related projects at our organization. And as Theo mentioned, I work at UPMC Enterprises, which is the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center's sort of technology group. So we sort of build technology platforms for the healthcare industry, and we have the privilege of having the hospital arm and our clinical arm to sort of test these things and build on them. And then it's sort of, if they go well and they work at scale, we can spin them out into their own entities. So we'll sort of jump right into sort of how I'm going to define design system. And you've probably heard tons of banter around like, what's a design system? What does this look like? What does this mean, right? It's a very trendy term, and I think it sort of makes up a lot of different things. There's a bunch of things on screen here, principles and rules and scoping and guidelines and patterns. Patterns is probably one of the most sort of trendy terms in relation. Best practices, potentially branding guidelines and language around that, and specific components, right? But I think most important to this conversation today, I want to focus on really looking at scope and rules. And I'm curious to see, as well as like how you guys have heard or defined design systems in the past, so feel free to throw this in the chat if you want. But again, looking at a tool, basically a little bit more detail on how I'm going to use this definition, but a tool to help you and your team align and focus on the critical parts of your experience through rules and components. And I think critical parts of your experience, not the entire thing, right? You can't sort of boil the ocean, if you will, can't do all of it all in one go. And sort of rule-based mechanisms can help facilitate that dialogue in your organization. And again, there's sort of two landscapes. There's the starting from scratch, and there's building on existing products or trying to update your legacy. And for the things I'm going to talk to you today should work in both of those cases. I've used them in both, so we'll see if it works in your organizations too. But sort of why do we start with talking about rules? And I think the benefit here is it's tech stack agnostic, it's platform agnostic, it's foundational, and it's scalable. The thing that sort of is the trickiest here is it's not very tangible. So when you're trying to present something or show this to the rest of your extended team, especially in software, it's like, how do I show this thing that's just maybe a couple sentences? And it may not come across as well, but I think the challenge is how do you build past that and say, well, this is foundational in the same way, sort of you have to decide what tech stack you're going to use. This is sort of the equivalent of like, why are we going down this rule or this path? And here's some examples that sort of bring together what a rule might look like. So you can imagine handling hover actions on desktop versus mobile, right? Like that's something you have to consider. We live in a world where the expectation is these tools work on any device. So how do you handle this, for example? Do you really want to deal with this for every action? Probably not. For yourself and for your users, that's going to be a lot of work and sort of mental capacity to think through. So you can sort of think, okay, well, all the actions that are on desktop that are concealed on hover, we'll just reveal them inline on mobile, right? Like that's one way to do it. May not be the best for your product because you might have 20 options, let's say, and then your whole screen is just a bunch of random buttons. So maybe not best in all cases, but that's sort of one simple way to look at it. Or even thinking through system notifications. So this one, I've had a fun sort of whirled around for probably a year. We talked about notifications, system notifications. But basically, what do you do with all this messaging? What's the level of hierarchy of these things? What's actionable? What isn't? How do you present this? Decision fatigue and sort of notification fatigue is a big thing in a lot of the tools I've worked on. And this was something we took very seriously and spent a lot of time thinking about. But again, like you could say all actionable messaging shows up as a toast message in the top corner, and then all informational just sort of appears in line, right? Like that's one way to reduce that, and a rule that would make it clear to your internal team and your user group what the expectation of that stuff is. A third example, which I'll bring some sort of visuals to, is talking about hiding versus disabling a button. So you may say, okay, when's the right time to hide an action? When's the right time, whether you should disable that action? Is it based on user permission? Is it based on availability? What does this look like? And the scenario we had was we were trying to reverse a transaction. So this is a research payment tool within the healthcare field. And the idea here was there's a time box exercise on reversing that transaction. You could only do it within the first week. Otherwise, it was considered done and the payment was transacted. And what the issue was in this case, where we had sort of this reverse here, and then after the time went away, that 1 week, it disappeared. And you would have folks calling in or contacting support saying, where'd my option go? Like it's missing, something seems broken or something seems off, right? So again, it fell on us to say, well, okay, so their expectation or their thought is the tool's broken, right? Fair enough. That's not a great place to be. Especially since in this system, there's very few actions that were time sensitive. So this was even doubly jarring than if it was sort of a standard convention across every action. So thinking about that with the team and thinking through, well, how do we solve this both here and for future features and the other sort of grouping? We said, well, what if we come up with a rule or a logic around what this might look like? So we said, if the permission is actionable during my experience, then we'll disable it so that it doesn't show as broken and missing. It's there, but it's intentionally not available to you for X, Y, or Z reason. So that's sort of the second state we added, right? So if you had it available, you've passed that 1 week time space, great, we've disabled it, we show you it's still there, but you can't take action on it today. And then if you never had that action, we didn't want to tease you into an action that you can't perform, so you just didn't have the option, right? And we could even take this a step further and say, well, since folks don't actually read user manuals or all that other work, we could put a tooltip or some other information on top of this to say, well, you've hit the 1 week mark, and here's why this function is disabled. We haven't gotten there yet, but that could be something we add going forward. And I think generally, right, this level of helped reduce user confusion and inevitably reduce support calls. So there's sort of a value add there, small win, if you will. And I think that sort of runs into this quote from Bruce Lee. Funny enough, I used this actually in my master's thesis a while ago, but when you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water into a bottle, it becomes a bottle. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Water can drip and it can crash, become like water. So the idea is that it's this fluid, dynamic thing. And I think in the same way, like these rules are fluid. You can apply them to sort of any state, any platform. And this is sort of the graphic I use to sort of talk through that is you can imagine this as your rules or your system to think through this, and you can apply it to screen-based interfaces, voice-based interfaces, AR, VR, who knows, right? Some future platforms we haven't even thought about. The same logic would apply, but it might manifest in a different way on those platforms. And I think that this sort of transitions this fluidity into this other concept about how do you compartmentalize or group components. So I like to think about it like a Vento Box, like more or less like your lunchbox, right? So you can think about these components of your application, and the coming together is what makes that experience. So like your different types of meal pieces, whether that's the salads or what have you. And you don't have to worry about the smallest unit right out the door. It's sort of the grouping of it that's key. And the reason I say this is because checkboxes and radio buttons are probably not the central experience of your product. Someone's coming to your tool, maybe they're answering a question, they're selecting a preset, or they're sort of selecting some options, but they're trying to provide care, or they're trying to make a payment, or whatever have you. They're not there for the checkbox. They're there to solve their problem, right? So that's sort of why I have this phrase, and we're going to keep playing on this this metaphor a little bit more. So here's sort of an illustration of what you might imagine as like a sort of funny Vento Box, but you have sort of your some simple ingredients, you have some more complex sort of components, you have sort of both savory and sweet sort of all together, and this grouping is what creates that meal, if you will. And if you take this and think about it, okay, well, this is sort of our application. Well, you could almost imagine it like this, right? So you have checkboxes, you have buttons, you have some simple things, you have some more complex things, table layouts, date pickers, etc. And coming together, that combination is sort of what's key here. It's not each thing standing on its own. And I think this GIF says it quite well, right? Is the combination of these flavors are magical. So as this cheese and strawberry sort of thing, the checkbox alone isn't going to solve your problem. It's the workflow that you guys spend all the time, and we all spend a lot of time trying to design. To sort of set another way, you don't have to worry about growing your own rice and farming your own fish, at least not yet. Like, to start out, that's not critical. You can instead worry about prepping the existing components from either existing standards and systems or just browser defaults. So the nice thing is, if you're working in browser and even on mobile or native application, there's a lot of basic stuff that's handled for us. So we can take advantage of that, which is awesome, right? So here's one example. These are date pickers just from the web. So it's Chrome, Edge, and Firefox. They all have default date pickers. And if this isn't central to your experience, then you can sort of say, job done, here you go. We'll use this one for the time being. It's something users are familiar with, especially if they're used to these operating systems, right? There's some subtle differences between each, but nothing crazy enough that would necessarily warrant having to build this. Maybe if you're in the travel industry and this is more critical to your experience, sure, spend the time. But if it isn't, allow it to sort of be presented to you. So again, sort of thinking about that as one of these components, you sort of build off of it and let it exist and worry about the combination. And I think why is this sort of particularly interesting or important is especially within sort of when you think about your organization. So of course, design is one part of the larger organization or your business. You think about sort of the UX maturity of your organization and how that influences your design system. So I think this is key in the way that there might be several levels. So for those who are familiar or aren't familiar, here's sort of a rundown of the different stages. You can sort of think of it as sort of not having UX being treated sort of as just the aesthetic, just the sort of end phase, then UX being part of the process, helping to inform product strategy, and then being part of the organizational strategy. And I think sort of if you think about it in that way, this might help to influence how deep your system is. You can imagine pulling off an existing, right, those browser defaults. Like, okay, if you're far lower on the UX maturity, you're going to probably want to pull more heavily on that kind of work. If you're at sort of level 5 or above, right, like you're really part of the global strategy, then okay, maybe you can spend the time to think about all these details right out the gate. And I would say, like, starting small is totally cool, right? Like, we all have done it. Don't feel like you have to solve all of this together. There's a lot of stuff out in the world that's far more formal than just browser defaults. There's obviously Google Material Design. There's Microsoft's Fluent UI, Shopify's Polaris, IBM's Carbon, and tons more existing systems out there. And there's this great site by UXPin that put together Adele.uxpin that sort of lists them all out. And you can explore these, see what their principles are, and sort of what made them build and sort of think about their systems in the way they did. I think the one thing here that's really key is these systems might have components that are sort of all necessary for you, but think about, again, those rules. A system like material design may be more focused on consumer product, where something like an IBM Carbon system is more focused on sort of enterprise products. So think about that as you start to think which one you might want to adopt based on your products. That way, it sort of best aligns, and you don't have to worry about trying to change these or sort of misalign your sort of main goals, right? So I think even look at their rules as a guiding principle and see if yours align or not. And I think sort of the next piece is thinking about, okay, now let's explore an existing. So I want to take a look at something that I tried to help influence in the past and some stuff that's out in the wild. So you can imagine these 4 cards here, sort of in a newsfeed, if you will, sort of demonstration. You're probably thinking, oh, this seems pretty legit. Like these cards all look like they go together. Maybe there's a little bit of differentiation between the icon and the timestamp, right? Well, the funny thing is, these are supposed to represent 4 unique brands, but they all feel like they're one, right? So in the way that we built this, we actually didn't facilitate the need for our client in the way we needed to, because it was too homogeneous for what we needed, right? And I think there's a great example that Condé Nast International did, right? Again, looking at other industries where they thought about their suite. They thought, okay, well, we've got a base component, which is image, some copy, the title, the byline, and the date. And then they said, well, can we take that and sort of stylize it and give it its own flavor based on each of their publications? So showing here Vogue and GQ, right? Nothing too crazy. They changed some type. They changed some of the colors, some of the case, some of the location of the elements, but enough that it let the brand sort of own part of that without having to rebuild this from scratch for each one of these platforms. And I think that goes sort of to what our system failed to do. Our system was too rigid. We had 50 plus applications that were all running on the same system, but the rules and the implementation was far too rigid for each brand to make it their own. And I think part of the issue here was the sort of twofold. One is branding wasn't considered central theme when the system or these applications were being built. And technology wasn't as mature when this started. This was probably 10, 15 years ago at this point. So I think those are the two pieces. And the third was, I think it goes back to that UX maturity, is it was sort of jumped the gun where the technology was being built before the thought was really gone through, like, what's the best way to handle this? What are we trying to do? Right? I think if you thought we're an agency looking to build X for tons of organizations, you'd think, hey, brand is important. And I think that time just wasn't spent right out the gate. So that's sort of, I guess you could say, a little bit of the issue in this system being so rigid. But Condé Nast did a really good job at handling that brand language, right? So they of course had just a little bit of flavor. I mean, they're essentially the same, but enough that in context you can tell that it's owned by themselves and has their own branding. So I think this sort of rolls to what's the benefits of a system outside of just execution and building. Is there's a couple things. There's reduction in startup time for you and your team. There's consistency and clarity for you and your team and your users. So I think these all apply basically to your internal teams as well as your users, because they don't have to try and sort out what you're trying to do. It's sort of more obvious to them. You're reducing decision fatigue. And I think this one's missed a lot, because I think this is one of the biggest issues we have is as our tools get more and more complex, especially in such a sort of robust industry like healthcare, when you go down these specialties, these tools are getting way, way more complex because they have to meet the needs of our users, and it's hard to keep track of every detail. So if we can sort of remove some of that complexity mentally, even for us and our teams, it makes life easier to execute on it well. Again, I think it's easier to scale. It allows for someone to say, okay, these are sort of the base rules. This sort of fits that mold. Let's run with it. And you can use that either within a production product or even prototyping. So you don't have to spend tons and tons of time trying to figure out what should this interaction be. And it allows you and your other UXers and extended team to focus on the main experiences, right? Again, if we're just using the date picker for something like date of birth, or something to the effect of a encounter date, does it really need to be anything more robust than what we talked about? Probably not. Maybe if you're in the travel industry, sure, you need date ranges and you need availabilities and all this other stuff, but probably in most of our experiences, that isn't the key. It's something else. It's about providing care or something along those lines. And I'll talk through sort of one of the scenarios that I recently went through, which was looking at a design system that I had played with. We had 4 new products in 6 months, and I was the sole designer. So it was quite informal of a system, but it helped us actually do this, right? And I think a lot of folks are probably thinking that's a little bit of a crazy number, and you're not wrong. I think it was crazy for all of our teams as well. And I think having these sort of basic rules and some basic components that were sort of visualized and designed out helped us sort of get to the point of, we don't have to worry about this when we're working with our engineering team. We don't have to worry about communicating this to our other stakeholders, or even just get folks on board to understand, does this facilitate their problem? I mean, this was very informal. It's a working design file in Figma, and it's a bunch of conversations we've had with the engineering and product extended teams. So it doesn't have to be crazy formal. A lot of the ones that I shared, like the Google Material and IBM Carbon, those are far more formal. They have sort of the bandwidth to do that, and of course their scale is at such that they need that. But it doesn't have to start there. You can make it a working design file or part of a file, and you can just build conversation around it. And that's sort of how I've started to do it in the past 6 months in this system compared to previous ones. And I think sort of the next step here is, how do we start to formalize this a bit more so it can go beyond these 4 products? Can we look at it for the organization wide and extended development engineering team? So I think it's like, start to formalize some of the documentation and write some of these rules down so they're not just in my head and a couple other team members' heads, and then start to actually bake that into the dev components as well. So yeah, we can tie them together, but what if that just came together? The rule and the styling of the component came as one, you just had to pick it up, and that logic was baked in. That could be sort of next steps to formalize it and make it even more sort of usable for the team. I think in sort of summary, I want to bring back sort of the five things we talked about, which are sort of the value of rules, the logic and the principles really will help guide that experience, agnostic of your tech, agnostic of your platform, and it's very scalable. I mean, you can talk about it within sort of any context. The fluidity and easily adapting those experiences to their context. Our experiences are going to continue to change. Many of us working from home, and even the way we're doing these presentations today is probably not what we expected 6 to 8 months ago, right? But we've all sort of adapted and sort of learned what works and what doesn't, and that's going to continue to happen in both our industry and sort of the world of how we develop. Thinking about sort of the combination of pieces is more critical than starting at every tiny detail. Of course, there's the want to like make sure everything is perfect, but maybe not the first pass. You sort of come back an iteration, you can go deeper and deeper into the details. And then I think the other 2 is really looking at your organizational UX maturity and how that's going to help guide sort of what level of depth and how formal or informal this process can be. And it'll lead to conversations around what can we use off the shelf and what should we build ourselves. You might see things to the effect of, well, okay, buttons and basic interactions with moving files around, right? We may all have sort of tools that need to do this, but what if like there's a cardiology group and a radiology group, right? They have visualizations that are unique to both of their groups. Sure, right? Like both of those teams can sort of own those pieces prior or sort of outside of this framework. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to create great experiences, and those great experiences should be really smooth. And I like this GIF that sort of talks through how smooth it is, right? Like it's such a flawless sort of entry here. And these design systems are just one tool to help be smooth, if you will. In our work, the great design is sort of invisible to our users, and that's what we're all trying to do. So that's all I've got for the team for today. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rehan. Yeah, we have 2 questions here. If you're okay with that.
Yeah,
The
let's do
first
it.
one, it's about, yeah, so the first one's about the slides. So the slides are going to be available. Will you be able to download them onto our Slack group?
Yeah, I'll paste them there. Yeah, it's a Google slide deck, so I'll just paste the link there, and folks can grab it shortly.
Awesome, thank you. So where do you see atomic design fitting into this?
Yeah, sure. So that's an interesting one, right? I think that's one that a lot of our teams have tackled with, and actually that's a pretty common one I get to. Being based in Pittsburgh, of course, Brad Frost, he's a resident here. So it sort of comes down to, I think, again, related to UX maturity and sort of the bento sort of metaphor, where I think the atomic system looks at sort of those atoms, those molecules, organisms, etc., and it starts at the smallest unit. And I think that you can sort of assume that some of that stuff already exists, whether you've done it or not. So you can almost imagine you're starting at the organism level, where like the date picker and the stuff that makes that up is sort of for free, if you will. I think that's sort of how it fits in, and you can progress sort of to the higher level, and then you can come back and say, like, let's research how we build our own atoms from there. That's sort of how I'd explain that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we do have some time. I think we've got about 5 minutes for any other questions. Just delete them. Okay, super. Rehan, thank you so much. That was very informative. Great stuff. Actually, Jonathan just popped a question through, yeah?
Yeah, sure.
So how do you use your design systems to communicate with your dev?
Yeah, this is a great one. So I think this is really key, right? I think we call them design systems, but it's not just for your group of designers. It's really for everyone that's trying to build that product, because it's again, right, it's more about the rules and the logic around it, which applies to everyone who's trying to solve that problem. So what's traditionally the product team and the product managers, your UX team and your engineering team sort of all come together. I think there's sort of two phases to Jonathan's question. One is, I think you should involve them in that logic up front. Like, which of these components you sort of think through, what's the central experience you're trying to build? What are central components that are critical? And then you sort of think with your engineering team, which of these are actually painful to build, which aren't? What makes the most sense to sort of pull out of the box? Find out from them what they've used in the past. I think that's one way to do it. And I think more sort of informally, I have a live Figma file that I share out with the entire team. And I say, as we continue to progress through the problems we're solving, feel free to look at this. These are the components, and I'll start to document things here and there. And folks will ping me and say, can we have a conversation? I'm curious what this looks like, right? So it's open communication is sort of the way to do it. I don't like the concept of lobbing things over the fence. It's sort of an active dialogue. And I've definitely made changes based on engineering needs, because it wasn't critical to the experience. It was secondary, right? So we sort of designed for that too. I think the expectation, or sort of a little bit gets lost, is the end user, the person using the product, is one of our users. Our internal team is another user we have to design for too. So we have to design a little bit for our engineering team and the business to make sure these things all sort of work together.
Okay, and we have a next one here from Janet, and she's asking, do you validate your design system with clinicians?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely parts of it that we do. Not all of it, because I think there's just too much that sort of, too much stuff that people are used to, right? You imagine button states and those kinds of things, where like we're used to using the web, we're used to sort of smartphones. We don't need to talk through it, but things that are more clinically relevant to their workflows or might not be known to us. Let's take an example in radiology, where they're reviewing images at high rates on multiple screens in these huge sort of workrooms and workspaces. Yes, those components we definitely need to look at, as like, what information is critical, what's the hierarchy here that's really necessary to bring forward, and what's a usable controls to get there. Is it mouse input? Is it something else, right? So those rules in those most critical workflows, we definitely validate and test with before we formalize with our clinicians.
Okay. Just one question from my side. I know you've got a background in dev, but is there any sort of advice you can give to practitioners who don't have dev experience, who's having to deal with a team?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of this is ask questions to your internal developers. I think there's as organizations start to scale, these things start to divide where your teams get separated, and I think you got to try and push them back together a little bit, because a lot of the folks that you've probably worked with and a lot of folks I've worked with, they're always willing to talk through it. So I don't think there's anything too formal. But some of it's learning the language, and some of it I use basically as a communication. So we can, in some ways, cut some cycles, if you will. So you imagine sort of a responsive grid. It's built in columns. Sometimes I won't bother making pixel perfect designs. I'll just say make the form field small-6, and we'll call it a day, right? And like using some of that lingo helps to just say, let's cut a cycle, let's do it almost live, if you will, and make those iterations a little bit faster. So I guess some of it's learning the lingo, some of it's just being open to having that dialogue and asking questions, because most of these folks are more than happy to share their knowledge with you as well.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. They're very open to share, and especially when you're trying to get into their world.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Rehan, thanks so much for that. Really informative. Thank you so much. We will be sharing the.
Have a good one. Thanks, guys.